Welcome back, STS Nation. This is the Geographic Profiler podcast, and I am your host, Douglas MacGregor. At STS, we have the best insight into real crime and the best talk in true crime. Today, we're back with professional tracker, Kathy Decker. Kathy is going to teach us the tricks of the trade, how to identify sign, track people, and paint a picture of a crime scene in motion. She is also going to give us a tracker's insight into the cases of Luigi Mangione, Rachel Morin, and Maura Murray. Please hit the like and subscribe, leave me your comments, and share to your platforms. All right, now let's dive in for part 2 with professional tracker, Kathy Decker. So now that we've talked about the Sam Sayers case, then eventually we'll get into some more suburban and urban environments and talk about how you go about tracking somebody in those environments. But maybe you can just walk us through these slides, and for our listeners who are listening on an audio platform, you can kind of describe what you see.
You bet. Now, this is a great slide. It really describes what we're talking about when we talk about measuring the print. So this is what we would call a signature print. And what I mean by that is it's easily recognizable to the eye by even non-trackers. It looks like you would expect a footprint impression to look like, made on loose soil. It has a really good formation to it. The tread pattern is easily detectable and seen. We can tell where the toe is, where the heel is. So from a tracking standpoint, if we get lucky and we see this, we become very excited because there's a lot of information that we can get off of this track. But this shows how we measure and take measurements. So as trackers, what we want to do is measure the overall length of the foot impression that's on the ground, the toe to the heel. And this is important because the overall length of that impression should match the overall length of whatever the shoe is that made that impression, not the same as the shoe size. So what I mean by that is a shoe that's sized to be a size 10 may actually measure an overall length of 11 inches. All shoes are a little bit different. So you have to really guard against not getting caught up in, well, it's a size 9 shoe, therefore it must be 9 inches overall length. That's not correct. So we want to take the overall length measurement of that impression. We want to measure the width of the ball of the foot, and this is in the widest place that we can see. We take that width measurement. We then want to measure the width of the heel, again, in the widest place. We want that measurement. And the heel length is the length of the heel from the last point where the shoe touched at the edge of the shoe all the way up to the instep is your heel length. And that's often going to be, somewhere maybe along 3.5 inches, something like that. It's going to vary. And in this particular print, you can see the instep, which makes it really easy. In a skate shoe or like a tennis shoe that doesn't have that instep, you have to just kind of wing it and guess and pick a spot to try to get that heel length and then be consistent with those measurements as you go forward. So once you've obtained these measurements, now you have that baseline. So as you're moving forward and tracking this person, following one print at a time, not all your footwear impressions are going to look like this. This might be the only one you get that looks like this. And so these measurements become important because maybe as you're following this person and you're a mile into this now, and all you're getting is the width of the ball of the foot that's showing up. You can measure that and say, okay, well, we're still in line. We have the right width measurement. We can still say that we're within that continuity of sign lines. So we're following step by step by step. We haven't veered off that sign line. So based upon that, we have a regular stride interval. We are confident we're still on the right person. And then maybe you go forward 4 more steps and you're not seeing the ball of the foot. Now you're seeing the heel width only. So you can measure that and say, okay, good. Now we're consistent again with that measurement. So it becomes important. And then obviously at the end of the day, when you actually find the subject, and or if it's law enforcement executing a warrant and you have a shoe that you're interested in, you can match up those measurements and then say that, hey, for what it's worth, the measurements of the shoe off suspect John Doe's foot coincide with the measurements we took on the ground of the suspect that we were following. So that all becomes circumstantial evidence that can be helpful for investigators.
You're an investigator, a SAR operator, a tracker. Do you wear every hat at the same time, or are you constantly switching back and forth, or is it just automatic now for you? It's kind of...
Oh, great question. And no, much like yourself with varied skill sets, you can't ignore what you know. What you know is what you know, and it's in your head, right? And so the best thing you can do with that is just work with it and acknowledge the fact that, okay, now what I'm thinking about and looking at is more in the investigative realm, but that's okay. And I'm going to switch back and focus just on the tracking piece. Wait, I need to stop now and consider it from a search and rescue coordinator standpoint. What other resources do we need to call in to help us get to where we need to get so we can find this person more quickly? So yes, you're constantly going back and forth, back and forth. It's not always easy, but I think, and you probably agree with this, when you've done it for a number of years, it becomes a little bit more manageable. It often means, at least in my case, it often meant I had to do 2 reports. So I did 1 report for law enforcement, the offense report or incident report, and then I did a separate report that dealt with the tracking piece. Because they're a little bit different. They cross over, and there's obviously some similarities, but there's also some differences. And tracking is physical evidence, so it's a part of whatever it is that we were doing at that particular scene.
And you know, when you were discussing this image here, which is a footprint in a shoe print in dirt and loose gravel, it you know, when talking about a suspect, it just, you know, the first one that comes to mind is, you know, Richard Ramirez. I mean, that's what they first kind of started to identify a suspect, is when they found a shoe print. Unfortunately, they released that type of shoe to the public and he switched shoes. But it was so important in the case, to locate in that suspect, that specific shoe print, how important something like that can be.
Oh, it's hugely, and I also should mention, occasionally, if we get really lucky, we'll see some type of anomaly within that footprint impression evidence that's specific only to that particular shoe worn by that particular suspect. So, for example, sometimes hunters or military will purposely cut out a lug on their boots so they can readily identify their own sign from that of hundreds of others who are wearing similar types, makes, and models of footgear. And suspects might do that as well, either intentionally or unintentionally. But if we can find something like that, maybe there's a defect in that particular shoe, a wear pattern, or something is caught within the tread of a particular shoe, and we're seeing that over and over and over again, that's additional evidence that would link that particular shoe to that particular impression. And then you could always use a forensic podiatrist that would actually take the foot of the sign maker and place the foot of the person that you're interested in into the shoe that you're interested in, that links back to the impression that's at the scene. So there's all these different ways forensically to get information that's really going to be helpful.
Next one we have here is so it's a foot impression in sand, And
Yes.
and Kathy, you can describe this to us.
Sure, and this one's a little bit more difficult to see for those that have the visual. So basically, this is in sand because it yields the easiest visual for us to understand locomotion and how we move about as humans, as bipeds. So when we walk, the heel comes down, and then the foot flattens out, and then we have the toe dig as we're lifting up to take the next step. So that would be the most common form of sign that we would expect to see, or different aspects of that. So sometimes you might just see the heel strike. Sometimes you may just see the toe dig. Runners, if we're trying to track someone who is a runner or a jogger, I mean, that toe dig and that heel strike become paramount. We can often easily see that as the person is moving quickly and putting a lot of weight on the ground at those particular points. So yeah, this is a good dynamic. It just reminds us how it is that we walk and how we move about. This was representative of how sign might look to the tracker's eye. Someone who is barefoot, someone who has a stocking foot, and someone who is wearing a boot. All three of these are representative of sign evidence. All three of these can be tracked. The key is, as a tracker, is recognizing what it is you're seeing on the ground. So a bare footprint can look sometimes like a bear print. What you want to look for is where the toes are really digging in to the ground. That's usually very distinctive, as is the heel compression. So someone who is barefoot in the woods, which I know sounds odd, however, I can tell you I've tracked probably 3, maybe 4 cases where that person was barefoot in the woods and very comfortable in doing that in the Pacific Northwest. It is fairly easy to track them, so it's not as hard as you might think that it is. The stocking foot, for me, is probably the most difficult, just because you're dealing with fabric impressed on the ground. So in this photo, because we're on a soft kind of soil surface, it shows up fairly easily. It's going to be maybe a little bit more difficult to see in a wooded environment. Moss would be compressed, but moss also resurrects itself and comes right back up to reshape fairly quickly after being stepped on. So stocking foot can be a little bit more challenging, almost like following somebody wearing moccasins. A boot track, of course, we're going to be looking for the specific tread pattern of that particular foot gear. A boot will often leave a lot of damage, not just to the soil, but also to the vegetation that it's as it compresses and steps on and moves forward over that vegetation. Vegetation gets torn, cut. You're going to see flagging, which is long leaf vegetation like grass. When you step on grass, it pushes it forward and points in the direction of travel. So if you think of a grass blade that's standing upright, when the foot comes down on that and pushes it down, it pushes it forward in the direction of travel. So as a tracker, and actually even non-trackers, you could stand back in a grassy field or meadow and count how many people went in, and then ultimately count how many people are coming out. That sign will be very distinctive for quite some time. Weather variables, of course, come into play, but that will be pretty obvious to the eye for quite some time. So these are all examples of what trackers can do, and it just understanding what it is that you're seeing and recognizing, for example, the stocking foot might be like confusing at first, like what is this? Is this person in a moccasin, or what's happening? Oh wait, now we have an area where we can see some fabric. No, this is a stocking. That's what's happening. Or maybe there's a hole in the stocking at the big toe, and you're getting the foot, you're getting the toe print, and then you're getting a fabric impression. So you just have to figure out what it is that you're looking at. And that's where that team of 3 comes into play. That's really helpful.
It helps to know something about the missing person or the target, the person you're looking for. An example I have is recently I've moved in the last year, but my previous neighbors, it was a nice couple. I think they had 3 young boys, but they would walk around the block in bare feet. I thought they were absolutely crazy because of all the things on the street that you could step on and hurt yourself, but they would go for family walks in bare feet on the road. So I get, there are people that do go walking in bare feet.
Absolutely. And some of, autistic children often will be barefoot too. So you do need to know something about who it is that you're following and what their habits are. What do they typically do?
How would you go about finding the print that you're looking for in a clutter of prints such as this?
And this is a great representational slide. We use this in our training regularly because typically, if you were to tell a tracking student who's new to the tracking program, new to learning this, hey, trackers can find sign evidence even after 300 searches have been through. They're going to look at you like you've lost your mind. So this is a good representational slide that shows that, no, we haven't lost our mind. You just need to trust that you can do that. And think about it differently. So don't think about this in the negative as contamination. Think about this in the positive. So what do I mean by that? Hey, this is a great surface area. This surface area shows sign evidence really well. As a tracker, that's great. I want to see sign evidence. I want to see all the sign evidence. And if I know what I'm looking for, what that tread pattern is, I would be able to pick it out even amongst all this other traffic. And even though we can't put a date timestamp on this piece of evidence, we can tell to some respect when it was made based upon layering. So all these other tracks that are covering up this particular track, why is that? Well, these are searchers that came in after the fact that were not trained in tracking, that unfortunately walked over some prime signs, some prime areas of evidence, but they didn't obliterate every single one. So as a tracker, I would be happy to work this because I can see it. And that's key. That's going to be key to what we're going to be able to do.
How do you search this without potentially damaging or stepping on the only print that's there that you're looking for?
No, great question. Well, first and foremost, you need to know what you're looking for in this type of scenario. It would be really difficult if you didn't have that information to pick out the right tread pattern. So knowing that ahead of time is, and in this particular case, this was a training problem where we knew what the tread pattern was of the child that went missing. So this is representative of that. And from this, we can say, okay, so now as a search and rescue coordinator, if you're bringing in search and rescue resources, are you going to put them, what direction do you want them to search? Let's not pick a direction that's opposite of the way that this child is moving, at least at this particular point in time. So that we have several techniques that we would follow that allow us to enter an area. We always want to enter into the light if possible. So we want the tracks to be between us and the light, the sunlight ideally, but we can also use a flashlight or some other light source if necessary. And that allows us the best opportunity to see the sign. And if we walk in single file and we pick out ahead of time how we're going to move about, we can fairly easily see what we need to see. Now that's not 100%. The key is not to go in, as a crowd. We need to stay in line, walk carefully. And again, you'd want at least 3. You might want to work multiple teams in this case, working in multiple directions, but all single file, looking to the right, looking to the left, looking in front of them to identify, hopefully, that one piece of evidence that's going to really help get things going. Also, I might say today with drone technology, I would love to have someone come in with a drone that could fly over this and I could stand looking at the screen. If we could do a low flyover, that would be another opportunity to recognize, hopefully, what we're looking for without having to walk in and risk stepping on the evidence.
That's a great idea. I just actually picked up a new drone and it's about the size of your hand. And it would be perfect for something like that. Are there any other, rudimentary or kind of advanced tools that a tracker uses or always has on them?
No, I think those are probably going to be the key ones. And trackers do not always have latent print pattern on them. Let me just make that clear. I had it because I was law enforcement and I had it easily accessible. And
Right.
I have ordered it. I actually keep some here in my office so that if I am called out on something that requires it, I have it and I can bring it with, and I'm familiar with how to use it. But a light source, yes, that is something that they all carry with us. So we would have that available. We can track in the dark. It is very possible to do that. Some trackers prefer tracking at night because there's not as much distraction. You're limited to where your light is being directed. If you're on the sign, it makes it pretty easy to see that next track. Of course, we use the tracking stick, which we haven't talked about here, but that is a tool that trackers use to identify based on stride interval and based on the overall length measurement of the foot, where that next track is going to be. So that would be, I would say, our primary tool is the tracking stick, and then the light source becomes secondary.
Okay, quickly tell us what the tracking stick is for.
So a tracking stick, and I wish we had a representation here, and I apologize. I would have thought to share one with you.
No, that's okay.
It's just a long rod, maybe 3 feet long, and it has maybe rubber bands that you can move back and forth on the rod. And what we do with that is we start out measuring the stride interval. And if we don't know the stride interval when we start out, because we don't, we often will just pick a number that's fairly common. So maybe 12 inches. So from the tip of the rod down 12 inches, we put a rubber band. That represents the stride interval. From that rubber band down, we represent the overall length of the impression. So if we have a 12-inch impression, then we have the stride interval that's 12 inches, rubber band. Then we have from that rubber band down to the next rubber band would be the overall length of that footwear impression. So when you place your tracking stick down on the ground and you have the heel rubber band matching up with the heel of the print on the ground, the toe rubber band matching up with the toe of the impression on the ground, the pointer at the end of your stick is going to show you where the heel should be for that next track. And so that's one way to pay attention to stride interval. And that needs to be changed periodically. So it may start out being 12 inches, and maybe the person, if it's a suspect, for example, that you're tracking, that might turn into a jog or a run, right? Depending upon the situation. So you would adjust the stride interval accordingly. And that becomes important to note in the tracking report, because that's a behavior change and characteristic of that person that might be important later on down the road. So that is, for us, the best tool. And if we don't have a tracking stick immediately available, although all the trackers I know do have one, you can always grab a tree limb if you need to. A ski pole works great in the interim, even the long barrel of a rifle, if that's what you need to work with. You just need something where you can maintain that consistent measurement. And then as you have that tracking stick down on the ground and you're looking for what that next heel compression is, you're going to want to move that stick in a 60-degree arc, so 30 degrees to each side, which is the normal range of motion for us as we move about. We don't typically turn in a 90-degree to make a right turn or a left turn. That would be unusual or odd. Not that it hasn't ever happened, but that really makes you stop and what's going on here? Why do we have that happening? So typically within that 60-degree arc, you should find that next print. It has to be there. People don't levitate. So it's just a matter of maybe taking an eye break, taking a bit of a rest if you need to, and then giving it another go. And you just keep following step by step by step.
Interesting. Yeah. And I guess we both draw a lot from lots person behavior and just human behavior in general. When you mentioned you don't usually take a 90-degree turn unless something forces you to do that. And just people in the wilderness, there's certain ages where you transition from walking the shortest distance to taking the path of least resistance, for example, because your brain matures and grows. you get older and you become smarter, right? And more knowledgeable of your surroundings. So that makes sense. And obviously we don't walk around our navigate our environments like dogs do. Dogs walk all over the place, here, there, backwards, forwards, and it's very sporadic, but we are a lot more calculated in the direction we're traveling.
Absolutely. And you made an interesting point. And I maybe think about dementia and Alzheimer walk away subjects, because they're regressing back. So you have a completely different behavior and movement that's happening with these individuals, which again is why it's so important to have an understanding of medical, emotional, mental health issues. All of that comes into play. So the more information we have starting out, the better it's going to be for us, and it will give us a better opportunity for success.
So this next image here, there's brush and there's a broken stick, and Kathy, I'll let you take it from there.
Yeah, so this is a good photograph. It just shows again some of the information that we can get if we pay attention. So within the sign here, within the footprint impression that's on the ground here, and these are dried leaves, some winter grasses, and a twig that's dry, so that when the foot came down on it, it caused the twig to break at both ends. And the important point here is it demonstrates the width of the shoe, so you can get some information right off the stick, just measuring it, as to what the shoe width would be of what you're following. So if you didn't have that already, you can add that now to your drawing, add that now to your information. And you can also look at those broken ends and get some sense of aging. So what I mean by that is, how brightly colored are the ends? Have they been weathered at all? Do they have any moisture from previous rain or dew? That's going to help you as well with aging this particular track, because this looks like fairly dry conditions at this point, from what I can see here. So this is all really good and helpful information for the tracker.
There should be a tracker on any outdoor and a lot of indoor crime scenes. Just, the number of cases that I've worked, the number of, crime scene photos I've seen or site visits I've done, where what I do would have benefited from what you do is extraordinary.
Yeah, it is a lost art and science, and I've never really understood why fingerprint, latent prints get a lot of attention. Blood spatter interpretation gets a lot of attention, but for some reason, we don't give any attention to tracking, visual tracking or man tracking, which is really unfortunate, because there's so much to be gleaned from it on indoor scenes as well as outdoor scenes.
This photograph is it's vegetation on the ground. Go ahead, Kathy, and describe to us what you see there.
So those that can see this, you might notice immediately a texture change and maybe a color change. Your eye's drawn to the center of the photograph, and then as you move your eye up towards the top, you're seeing specks of brown and dirt on top of this vegetation. That's important because dirt does not grow on top of leaves. So why is that there, right? And so transfer is important. So as we move about, and this is part of Locard's exchange theory, right? As we move about our environment, we're picking up evidence and we're depositing evidence. So if you imagine walking across a ground surface where you have some mud or loose soil and there's dew or some dampness, that soil and that mud's going to adhere to the tread, the outsole of your foot, of your shoe, right? And then as you move through the vegetation, like what's here, that's going to come off. It's going to be deposited on the vegetation. So this ends up being a really good indication that somebody has walked through here. And then we can look at the damage to the vegetation, the color of it, to make some estimates as to when this would have been made. We know that there's still pieces of soil, granules of soil on top of the vegetation. So there has been no heavy rain that's come down. There's been no snow. There's been nothing like that has wiped away that evidence. So that's another factor we would look at to help us with the aging piece. And from a tracking perspective, the more tracks you have, the more accurate you're going to be for estimating aging. It's hard to do just off of one track. So I'm just sharing with you a couple of the things we would look for that would help us do that. But this clearly is, to my eye, sign evidence. This is where someone has come through fairly recently and deposited the dirt and granules that have fallen off their footwear. So there must be some area near here that had some dampness to it for that soil to adhere to the tread of that particular shoe.
And most people wouldn't even notice this, right? They wouldn't even think anything of it. They wouldn't even think to look at it. The soil on top of the vegetation is transfer. It wouldn't process. It's incredible how you are able to, pick apart the environment almost like an architect or engineer can look at a building and see every little piece rather than the structure as a whole. So I find that fascinating. The investigator in you, the detective in you, do you find that a lot of law enforcement personnel are trained in this when they go to a crime scene? Do they know to look for this?
No, not at all. I think 99% of them wouldn't notice this either. And that's not their fault. There's just no training to help their eye recognize what it is they're seeing. And as you know, I have a whole presentation I give on understanding and recognizing what it is we see and how important that is to our brain to be able to make sense of what it is that's there. And for law enforcement, if it's blood, yes. Places where there might be fingerprints, absolutely. And I think more now are trained in what could be DNA evidence, which you can't always see, but there's an understanding of what to look for and what to collect. But when it comes to sign evidence and tracks, there just isn't that same understanding, which I've never understood, because if you're at a burglary, for example, and you have footwear impression evidence in the soil below the window, and you have the person peering in the window, and you've got the fingerprints. I mean, there's a lot of excitement about taking the fingerprint evidence and latent pattern. Nobody ever thinks to look on the ground, or even if they did, they wouldn't even know what to do with that. Or inside a home on linoleum flooring or wood flooring. Just because you can't see it, it doesn't mean it's not there. It has to be there. So you just have to figure out the technique, and maybe it's lighting, maybe it's using the black powder, whatever it is you need to do to highlight that so that you can see it. But for many law enforcement, and I include myself because I was also like that for a number of years, if you don't see it, it must not be there. But that's not logical, because we're people and we don't levitate. So it has to be there. You just need to get creative and figure out a way to allow your eye to see it. And then you need to train your eye and your brain to recognize what it is that you're looking at, which is what our training program does. All right, and here we have a slide that's a good representative example of urban tracking. So oftentimes people think that, oh, we're in a city, there is not going to be any way we're going to see tracks. We're not going to see footwear impression evidence. It's a city, there's cement, there's asphalt. Well, yes, but so in this particular case, there is some sediment that has probably been brought up by some type of insect that's burrowing here between the sidewalk cracks. And this individual happened to step on it, and it left a very nice partial tread impression that is going to be quite a bit of information for a tracker's eye. This is great to work with. So what we're going to be looking for now are additional areas. We might call them track traps. So additional areas within the environment where we would expect to see sign evidence, and we're going to look for the same pattern. What this gives us is a defined direction of travel, and that's huge. Okay, so we know this person now, let's say, is walking north on the sidewalk. What's to the right and to the left of them? Are there any natural or man-made barriers? Is this a corridor? Based on what we know about this person, where might they be headed to? What do we need to do to try to get to them quickly? So this is really helpful information. Also, when we think of cities, we know how much grime and sediment builds up in fine layers on top of the concrete, on top of the asphalt, along the shoulders of roads. So there actually can be really good areas to see sign if we just take the time to look. And often if we can even just get 1, 2, or 3 tracks going in a direction, then we can use some other tracking techniques to try to work this and intersect where those tracks might be headed to. So we would always want to leave a team on the prime sign being that sign evidence that you have right now that is your subject sign. But we have other tactics and ways we can deploy other trackers using natural and man-made barriers, using sunlight to perhaps intersect and pick up where the sign may be further ahead. So that's something that we would also be considering as we're working an urban environment such as this.
Where you'll be able to say, this is where this person's being, and then we can work together and I can come in and say, this is where they're likely going. Being that we complement each other so well, I think it'll bring new light to a lot of investigations.
Oh, I do too. And I think it will help to educate others as well. I think they'll find that the way that we work to be very interesting and unusual and dynamic, and that hopefully will get their attention enough that we can educate them and help them to do better next time.
And, looking at this urban tracking scenario here, it brings to mind the recent case of Luigi Mangione, the suspect in the killing of Brian Thompson, the CEO of United Healthcare. He shot and killed Brian Thompson allegedly in Midtown Manhattan in New York City, and then he was eventually arrested in Altoona, Pennsylvania, I believe. While New York City, Manhattan has an abundance of video surveillance to help them out in that sense, there are other urban areas that don't have that infrastructure. Urban tracking could really come in and help in those different cases and scenarios.
Yeah, potentially, yes. And so I've worked cases where we started off with video surveillance. Usually it's somebody's home surveillance video, a burglary scenario, where we can see the suspect, so we can see the type of foot gear he is wearing. And in this case, it was a he. Not that women don't commit burglaries, but in this case, it was a man. So we could see the type of foot gear he was wearing. So we knew before we started sort of what we were looking for. We couldn't see the tread pattern, but we could see it was a working boot. So we anticipated that we were going to have a tread pattern that was going to be fairly easy to identify, and it turned out that it was. So in the case that you're bringing up now, looking at CTV and looking at surveillance video, a couple of things come to mind. One is an idea of the type of foot gear he's wearing and what you might be able to say in regards to that. And secondly, just an idea of how he moves. What's his behavior? What are his body movements? And then you could take that possibly and use that to your advantage if, flash forward, you find personal effects or other evidence that the investigators believe associated with him that is in a separate area, right? So it's either been discarded by him intentionally or unintentionally. You can look for that footprint impression evidence at those sites where the evidence is found to connect him more to that evidence, because you could still, of course, potentially get latent prints in DNA, but that doesn't give you a date time stamp. It just tells you at some point he touched and handled that, which of course it's still circumstantial evidence. It's really good evidence, but if you can find his track or tracks there, then that even becomes further evidence. It strengthens what you already have to connect him to those articles.
When I reviewed the publicly available surveillance footage, I was able to, and I posted this on my X account, as well as some of my other accounts. I was able to determine that right away that it wasn't a professional hit. And I made that determination based off of the fear and uncertainty in his spatial movement. You can see that behavior in the movement, not only both in their behavior and how they're interacting with their space and their environment, but also in the sign they leave. So it almost, it reaffirms it, right? It reaffirms what I see and what you see. If they match up, it just reaffirms it, and it helps with the investigation.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you can see premeditation in sign, right? I mean, I've worked many cases where I'm tracking someone who has premeditated the murder or premeditated whatever the act is. You see that in the way that they're moving, right? They're moving forward with confidence. They have regular stride intervals. They've already pre-planned their route. They know exactly where they're going. They're knowing how they're going in. They're knowing how they're coming out. And these are all things that you would pick up on. So absolutely.
This slide, this last one here, it's on this slide, we have what looks like a wet towel on the floor in maybe an apartment or a dwelling. And
yes,
what
exactly.
do you see there, Kathy?
So this is a wet towel, and this was a reproduction of a sexual assault that had taken place. It was a serial situation in Washington years ago. And we reproduced this to show trackers that just because you're in an indoor environment doesn't mean you're not going to be able to find sign evidence. So maybe you're not able to see it on the floor, but let's look at some other areas. And in this particular case, during this sexual assault, it involved putting the victim in a bathtub after the fact. And so water was splashed onto the towel, and the offender was walking about on the towel. And in doing so, had left behind a very distinct tennis shoe print impression. Now, clearly, when you look at this towel, it's off of a work boot. But again, it's a representation for our trackers as we're training to help them understand that, hey, look for tracks in some other areas that you might not normally think to look, because wherever people have moved about, you're going to find something. And on a towel, especially one that's damp or has had water on it, there's some amazing information that could be contained if you look at it.
Until I met you and really learned what trackers are capable of, I always related it to the outdoors.
Yeah, it's amazing. And again, oftentimes you won't be able to see it initially with the visual eye. You need to use light source and maybe, like I said, latent powder to enhance or bring up those images. But usually between the two, you can see what it is that you're looking for. And for crime scenes, I mean, you're looking for suspect sign. Typically, that's going to be the sign that's on top of everyone else's sign in the house, right? So if you can identify that which is on top, that's the most recent. That's also typically a very good indicator that that's who you're looking for. And then based upon how that individual is moving about inside the house and how they got in the house, how they exit the house, and how they're moving about once they're outside, gives you all the information that you typically will need.
It would have been really interesting to have you first on scene in the JonBenet Ramsey case.
Yes,
you know, from JonBenet being in bare feet to the stool or whatever it was, suitcase, I think, in the basement near the window, and the window being partially open, so you have the exterior to look at, you have the interior. It would have been really interesting to have someone like you there at the beginning.
Yeah, tracking would have been a game changer for that case, I think, absolutely.
A case I worked for the family, Rachel Morin. She was attacked and assaulted on the Montpaw Heritage Trail in Bel Air, Maryland. And I worked that case for the family, and there's a suspect in custody. He's in the news right now because he's trying to get a change of location for the trial. I think he's getting an unfair trial in Harford County. So I hope he doesn't get a change of location. I don't think he deserves it. Rachel obviously deserved to live. But this is an image of the tunnel where Rachel was found. And this goes back to what we were talking about: behaviors, spatial behaviors, premeditation. Rachel was attacked on a bend in the trail, more or less a 90-degree bend in the trail, and you could kind of see 100 yards in either direction. And right beside that, just off the trail, about 60 yards off the trail, is this tunnel. And once you get about 15 yards in this into this tunnel, you disappear in that shadow, completely disappear. And you can't hear anything out of the tunnel as well, between the tunnel itself masking the noise and the foliage outside. You can't hear anything. So I was able to determine that, although the victim, Rachel, may have been opportunistic in the sense that this offender was waiting for a lone female jogger to come his way with no witnesses, no human surveillance in either direction at that time. So she may have been opportunistic in that sense. I still think that it was premeditated in the sense that he had picked the exact location where he had that line of sight, and he had a place to take a victim and conceal that body time enough to get away. That's a couple of the things that I took from this in terms of spatial behavior. But if you were on this scene, where would you have started in terms of tracking and trying to find where this offender entered and exited this scene?
No, great question. And it's always it is fascinating because what we do is not all that different. So at the point where the attack occurred, that would be an important area to evaluate and examine. So what I'd want to know primarily is, was he standing there in wait? If so, how long had he been there? And yes, that can be somewhat difficult to gauge, but maybe not. I mean, I don't know if he chewed gum, he smoked cigarettes, if there was anything else that he may have deposited that would give you some idea on timeline. That's helpful. Also, how did he get there? So backtracking. So where did he come from to get to that point? Did he have familiarity with that particular area? Are we going to find different age of his sign there over periods of time? So did he come and go from there regularly? So these would all be questions that I would be asking myself and our tracking team to try to answer. How much can we gain and glean from this particular examination? Next thing I would be interested in is looking at the actual site where her body was recovered. So the questions that are often asked of us as trackers is, can you tell us how she got there? So in other words, was she walked in on her own accord? Was she drug in? Was she carried in? This is all information that we should be able to identify based on the sign evidence. Dragging a weighted body, especially over what you have here in the photograph, looking at fairly large rocks. Those are going to all be displaced and moved out of their socket if you have a weighted object that's being drugged into this tunnel. This is important offender information. So what can we glean from this examination? Has he been in this tunnel before? Well, yeah, probably, right? So this was someplace he was familiar with. How familiar was he? How often did he come and go? And maybe not. I mean, we should be able to get some idea of travel in and out. How many people come in and out of this tunnel? Is he the only one? Is this around an area where you have homeless encampments? Are there other people that would come into this tunnel just to seek shelter, to get out of the rain, the wind, the cold? So these are all things that would need to be explored. But from a tracking perspective, that's what I would primarily be looking for in those two spots. And then ideally, if I could connect the dots, that's even better. Can I connect from the initial attack all the way to the tunnel? So hopefully we would be able to do that and provide some additional information about what the interaction was between him and her as they moved from one area into the area where she ultimately was killed. And as a tracker, I would really take time to examine the other end of the tunnel, even though there's knee-deep water. And the reason I say that is if he did opt to go that way for some reason, then you have to consider, well, why would that be? Did someone see him? Did someone yell out to him? Did he hear something? Did something happen in his environment that triggered that fear and flight response? So he caused him to go a way he would not normally have chosen to go. So that's important too, to kind of look and examine that and determine, okay, yes, that's correct. He did not go this way. So everything was status quo for him at that particular point in time.
Right. Something that might have forced them there, human surveillance, witnesses. And that was obviously a risk he took. I mean, the whole thing was obviously a risky crime, but risky attack. But that was a risk he took coming out this direction. Going the other direction, there's nothing there, right? There's nothing there. You're in between two highways. There's no exit point. You're not going towards, and usually, and you probably find this as well, when suspects abruptly leave a high risk scenario attack such as this, they just want to get to a comfort zone, a safe place, right? They don't want to go and be stuck out somewhere where they're not unfamiliar with, and they're going to be exposed to human and technical surveillance longer.
No, absolutely. You're absolutely right about that. The only time I could think where that would change would be, again, that fear response in that flight, where you haven't done your proper work ahead of time, and you haven't really examined what the other end of that tunnel looks like, and you don't know what you're getting into, and you realize you've made a mistake. But then that would be a quick in, out, turn around and come back scenario, which as trackers, hopefully we'd be able to identify that as well.
The last case I wanted to put up here, and I wanted to touch on it. It's obviously a high profile missing persons case. It's well known in the, in anybody that follows missing persons cases or true crime, and it's coming up on the anniversary of her disappearance, and that's the Maura Murray case. I myself have been on a number of podcasts discussing the case from my perspective, but I've never spoken to a professional tracker about this case. Now, most of the case, for what we're talking about today, we can most of the details we can skip over. Just for those who are unfamiliar with it, Maura Murray, she went missing on February 9th, 2004. Her place last seen, or point last seen, was on Route 112 in Haverhill, New Hampshire, where she got in a car accident. She was, potentially or allegedly heading towards the Bartlett area. She had looked up some lodging in that area. She had left her university and gone up to this area. She was 21 years old, and I guess from where her car crashed on, it was a snowy day, slippery roads. She crashed her car, and from that location, her car wouldn't start again. From that location to where she was headed, it was roughly 55 to 70 miles, depending on the route you took and whether it was on foot or by car. At that car crash, at that car deposition site, where would you have started as a tracker?
Oh, that's a great question. And that would be the place to start as a tracker. So the first thing we'd want to try to affirm for law enforcement is whether or not the person that you're looking for is the person who actually was the last person to have driven this vehicle. So how do we do that? Well, we're going to look for footwear impression evidence, and we can get that from inside vehicles too. By the way, I've been very successful off brake pedals, gas pedals, the door panel on the side of a door. These types of places often will hold a tread pattern, so you can glean some information from that. So we're looking for footwear impression evidence that would be the right size, the right shape, the right pattern if we have a pattern, the right composition, moving in the right direction, doing the right thing. So what do I mean by all of that? Okay, so you have somebody who's just been involved in an accident. Is this person thinking clearly? Have they suffered some type of physical trauma? Is there some reason that they're not as mobile as they should be? Are they injured? Are they operating off of adrenaline where they might be injured, but they can't feel and they don't realize that they're injured yet? So these are all behaviors that we would try to assess from that vehicle point. Then once we've done that, direction of travel becomes important, keeping in mind that just because a person starts out walking in one direction, especially after a car accident, they may not continue in that direction. So as trackers, we want to spend some time trying to confirm which way did she settle upon. Now, we do have, if I recall correctly, there was a witness that saw someone they believed to be her along the shoulder of the road. And so that would be a second point, a last known point, as we might call it in SAR language, that we could look at and examine. Are we finding any additional footwear impression evidence in that area that matches to what we found at the car? And if so, how is that person moving about? What's their direction of travel? And this would be helpful for law enforcement. So we could say, okay, look, if you're going to be starting a SAR, a search here, and I understand in this case there was a bit of a delay before that happened, but if you're going to be doing that, where are you going to put those resources? Resources are not unlimited. They're limited. So when you get those people coming in to help, let's put them in the best place with the best chance of being successful. And so if we can determine like where she's moving, how she's moving, we can help law enforcement do that. And I think that's where trackers would be the most beneficial for something like this. So establishing, if we can, was she in fact the last person to be associated with that vehicle? Are there any other intersecting tracks? Did someone else come onto that scene from somewhere else at the same time and converge upon her? Is there anything happening there that looks odd or unusual or needs to be explained? Okay. And then, what is her direction of travel? Can we affirm that? Did she start out going one way, then change direction, which you might expect to happen for someone who's disoriented initially? And then ultimately trying to link what we find there to the point where the witness saw who they believed was her along the roadway. And what can we do with that? Is there any difference in how she's moving there? What do we need to look for? Those kinds of things.
Well, I've looked at this case pretty extensively, and there's some things with the search efforts I agree with, and some I don't. I know that they initially, from the crash, they searched on the road west. It was back towards a gas station, which it does make sense. If she's in a crash, there's really three reasons to leave a car, right? To leave a vehicle. One's to find help, one is to get to where you're going, and the other is to avoid something like law enforcement. So going back to a gas station would make sense to look in that direction, but I don't find the search efforts in the direction she was going was as thorough as they could have been. From what I recall, there was some they brought canines in and they tracked her down the road a little bit, and then they lost that. I just feel like a sign cutter, a tracker, could have looked for things that those. I mean, the dogs are obviously looking for scent, but could have looked for things on the ground along the road that would have indicated her traveling in that direction as well.
Oh, absolutely. And we don't know about the canines. Presumably they were trailing dogs, but perhaps they were using a cadaver dog at that point, which would not be the best resource to use. However, that might have been what they had at hand. So we don't know that. But yes, I mean, we could also give some information at that last known point. Again, is there a converging sign? Is there a vehicle that's pulling off along the side of the road? Is she getting into a vehicle? Is somebody getting out of the vehicle? Are they having a conversation? I mean, these are all things that we would look for. And it's one of those instances where what we don't find is as important as what we find. It's all helpful information.
It's common knowledge with lost person behavior this day and age that if people are lost in the woods, yes, instead of, in the past, they may have gone downwards, right? Find some stream or just keep going downwards to hit a road. But now a lot of people will go upwards to find that cell service because they have a cell phone on them. So that is common, lost person behavior. What's your take on that as a, search and rescue or a tracker or an investigator perspective?
Well, there's probability and there's possibility. And so if I recall, this was 2004
Yes, it
time
was.
frame, right? So cell phone usage was still fairly new,
Mhm.
not as reliable perhaps as it would be today. But the big question that resonates in my mind is we don't know if she suffered any type of trauma from the accident, right? So
Right.
we can presume that she's thinking clearly because, yes, you're correct. She's very well educated. She's very intelligent. She could take care of herself, independent. However, if she did suffer some type of head trauma or something else is occurring here, there was some alcohol, I believe, or liquor bottles that were available. We don't know if she'd been drinking. I mean, there's all sorts of things that could come into play that are going to affect how she's thinking. But I do agree that it would seem unlikely to me that she would ought to either clear-headed or not clear-headed to walk to a high point looking for help. Because you're right, when you're in a situation like that, you start to get into that mindset of the bare necessities. What do I need right now? I'm cold, I need warmth, I'm hungry, I need food, I'm thirsty, I need water, I need shelter, whatever that is. That's just the humanity piece coming through, right? So she, you would think, would have been to a point where that's going to direct her more than anything else. What those basic needs are at that particular point in time would have some effect on her options and her choices. And again, even though she may have driven this road, it's not going to be familiar surroundings, from what I understand. So it's not like she could go off the highway, I wouldn't think, and be familiar with that particular area, and unless I was missing something on what I read. So, that's something to consider as well.
Yeah, I mean, again, there's lots of information about this case. She was actually fairly familiar with the area. She had been hiking in that area with her family growing up.
Okay.
So she was familiar with it, which, if she I mean, she's, like I said, she's physically fit. If she wasn't injured and she wanted to jog, I mean, she was a cross country runner, right? So if she wanted to jog the 50 miles, I mean, she probably could over a period of time.
Right, and that's part of the search planning. So I'm very interested in where she had camped with the family before and where she had hiked before. So really important intelligence information. That's going to be something that would really be helpful in trying to determine like where to look next. Would she then go to those points of interest, and how close was that to where the car crash was? I mean, these are all things I don't know the answer to, but would be something that you'd want to hopefully have access to information wise. And yes, so from a SAR planning standpoint, that's one of the things that a SAR coordinator is going to look at. What are the other routes and trails here, especially if she has some familiarity? Where else do we need to look? And we would do what's called a sign cutting operation on those trails and those roads, where we're basically, as trackers, walking down that route, looking for any sign of anyone within the time frame of interest that might be helpful for us. Even if it's not hers, it could be a potential witness or somebody that may have seen something or knows something. So that all becomes relevant.
Hopefully, Maura is found one day. Best case scenario, she's found alive and well. But if not, I hope the family gets some resolution one day. So, but thank you so much for speaking with me today. Your insight into criminal investigations, to search and rescue, and then specialized skills with the tracking has just been, eye-opening. It just shows, what skill sets and expertise are out there and available for law enforcement to apply in different scenarios to different investigations that obviously they don't have at their fingertips.
Oh, absolutely. And I echo your comments. I hope too that someday they will find her. There isn't anything more difficult than trying to search a wide area, a remote area, looking for human remains. That's probably one of the most difficult searches that there is, actually. So I do hope that at some point the family will have some answers, at least as to what happened and where she ended up. And it was a great pleasure today too, Doug, to talk with you. It's always exciting to find others that kind of see things similar to the way you do, and have the same passion for community service and wanting to bring answers for families that don't have answers, and to just provide support for law enforcement. I mean, it's so difficult for them. They're tasked with doing more with less. They don't have all the resources, all the money, all the time. And you think, well, the larger agencies do, but the larger agencies also have more crime. So that's the counter, unfortunately. It's never ending. So hopefully, as a collaborative effort, we can come together as an IRIS team or however that works. I think we have a lot of skill sets that we can share, and I hope we can do some good and maybe change the narrative on some of these cases that are just sitting that need to be looked at.
I'm looking forward to having you back on in the future, talking about specific cases as part of a panel. I think that'd be really interesting. It would add a lot to individual cases as they pop up. So I hope you do come back and join us for future discussions.
Oh, absolutely. I would love to. And keep in mind, there's a lot that we can glean from crime scene photos and from photographs of scenes. There's a lot of information there that sometimes isn't easily recognized by professionals, other professionals in the business. So I'm happy to be part of a panel. I find this type of work gratifying, and I hope to do more versus less. So let me know. I'll be happy to come back.
Great. Well, thank you, Kathy, and thank you, STS Nation, and we'll see you soon.